It is hard to recollect when my appreciation of history started, or even when I realised there was more to our great country than a few blokes landing on an island and calling it Australia. If questioned, I would most likely respond that it was my long summers with Grandad that sparked my fascination. The memory that presents itself is one of childhood fondness. Just as the sun was setting over the dry paddocks and the dust materialised in the rays of colour, I could be found curled in Grandad's lap, watching the image of beauty sink below the tree line. Glancing up, I mouthed the requests that sprang to mind each time we were resting like this. "Tell me a story, Grandad. Please tell me a story." Smiling down at me, his kind, wrinkled face dancing in the evening shadows, he would ask, "What kind of story would you like, my child?" As you are well aware, there are many stories that fill my memory. I would never be sure as to which story I wished to hear. For a child of my age, such a choice was impossible to make. However, Grandad always seemed to know just the right one to tell, and as I gratefully sank back into his lap, he would take me to another place and time. Those afternoons with Grandad spanned centuries, each day a different and vital part of Australia's past. His soft voice would float in and out of my head, like waves gently breaking on the shore, and I would listen with rapt attention. And this was how my childhood evenings passed, not one of them idle, but instead prying into our great country's past. One day, however, was different from the others. Usually Grandad would beam down at me with a twinkle in his eye as he indulged in another memory. But not this day. Sitting against the eucalypt tree after a particularly hot afternoon, I fell exhausted into Grandad's lap. "Tell me a story, Grandad. Please tell me a story." Today no smile flickered across his face, nor did he ask which story I preferred. He did not remind me of the many stories in his head, but instead closed his eyes and took a deep breath, whistling it out through his teeth. As I stared expectantly into his face, I was taken aback by his weariness. The glow of the setting sun had vanished from his face, to be replaced by the long shadows. A silence hung in the air for so long that I thought it was possible he had forgotten me curled in his lap. But suddenly he spoke, and his voice seemed to echo in the stillness. There is one story that I have wanted to share with you for some time. One of pain, hope, and sadness. But this story is very powerful, never to be regarded lightly, and it takes a great deal of heart to comprehend it. It really depends on whether you are ready. "Why yes, Grandad, I am ready," I enthused. Never before had Grandad seemed so touched in this way by a memory. I almost felt obliged to hear it. Grandad nodded slightly as I sank back into his lap and closed my eyes, listening to the voice flowing through my mind. It was 1914. Australia was a different place those many years ago, having just become an independent nation. Our hearts were young, and full of a thirst to prove ourselves. Many Australians believed our alliance was to England, the mother country, and were ready to give all they had for her. You must understand that Europe had its differences too. Oppressive tension had developed. Some countries yearned for dominance. The whole continent was like an avalanche waiting to fall, and it was the assassination, in Serbia, of the Austrian heir to the throne that proved the snowflake which brought the mountain down. After the death, Austria declared war on Serbia, which gave other European countries the chance to gain the dominance of which they had dreamed. The French were among the first to side with Serbia, and were shortly followed by Russia. Germany decided their interest lay with Austria, and along with Hungary and Turkey, joined a war that was to be spoken of with horror for decades to follow. You may be wondering, my child, how this tale relates to our homeland. Whilst Europe was exploding, being torn apart at the borderlines, Australia lay dormant and peaceful. Yet all of this was about to change, as Belgium, a country that decided not to participate in the war, was invaded during Germany's march on France. The treaty Belgium had with Great Britain proved their saviour, as the mother country and all her allies joined the battle. This was the beginning of the First World War. Now, as you could imagine, The word of war that had reached Australian shores sent men into frenzy. It was the calling they dreamed of, the chance at last to prove Australia as a nation and fight for Great Britain. Old and young raced to enlist, not stopping to think of the terrible consequences war inflicts upon life, but only of the honour they could bring home to their beloved country. One of these men went by the name of William Fletcher, and he, just like everyone else, thought it was an opportunity not to pass by. After going through the long process of enlistment, he was ready to set sail for war, ready to answer the distant call. But as to whether he was ready to leave behind his young wife and child, I'll never know. William was in one of the first boats to leave Australian shores. All the soldiers were given a right old send-off, with women and children cheering and clapping. The only damp eyes were those of family members who didn't feel they could spare their loved ones, yet none really believing that their husbands, sons and fathers may never return. This thought was too disheartening. Instead, they clung to the faith that the war will soon be over and their men will return as heroes. All of the Australian men began and ended their training in the sand dunes of Egypt. Long days were spent under the hot sun and endless nights in the cold desert, preparing themselves for whatever they may face, whatever stood in their way in this conflict. Very soon they grew tired of sand in their eyes, and even the camel rides and the Sphinx aroused little, if any, enthusiasm. A war was ablaze, and so were their hearts with eagerness to join the fray. The first test for the ANZACs came as they were posted to the Gallipoli Peninsula, told to make a quick job of it, take Constantinople by force, thus removing Turkey from the war. Give us a free pass to Russia, and the war will soon be won. The orders seemed clear and simple, and with nothing but optimism to fill the hearts of the young Australians, they too believed the war would soon be won. Some wrote home to inform their loved ones of their expected early return, and to have a good meal prepared because they were growing tired of Egyptian food. None of them could have foreseen that the Gallipoli Peninsula would soon be littered with their bodies, and the Mediterranean Sea infused with their blood. The operation seemed destined for disaster from the very beginning. Boats landed on the wrong beach, and as officers searched blindly on a map for their positioning, soldiers scrambled up hills and cliffs rather than the flat plains they were anticipating. The ANZACs pressed desperately inland, while childhood mates, family members and fellow soldiers fell beside them. The first Australian deaths in a horrid war on a foreign soil at a place far from home. The soldiers' luck didn't change throughout their whole time on Gallipoli. Oh my, there were to be acts of courage beyond belief, pluck that you and I can only dream of, mateship to pull together a dying force. But nothing could contend with the Turkish agility or advantage. The passing months saw many more brave attacks by the ANZAC soldiers, but they came to nothing. A glimpse of the Dardanelles was scarce among the soldiers, and if by chance they did sight the beautiful sea that every ANZAC was fighting tirelessly to conquer, it would be a treasured moment, a memory to keep forever of the water rolling over itself, ever so out of reach. On the 17th of December in 1915, the last of the ANZAC soldiers was seen leaving Gallipoli. With their boots muffled in rags, they passed silently around the graves of loved comrades. Although the cloth dulled the footsteps, it could not smother the screaming from inside their hearts. They were leaving behind their mates who had sacrificed themselves for success at Gallipoli. Their graves were now in the hands of the same men who took their lives. Inseparable bonds of friendship were now broken. William Fletcher did leave the Gallipoli Peninsula that scarred night, and was considered to be, all in all, an able soldier. So before he had the time to ponder any mistake he might have made in enlisting for the war that had already taken so many comrades, he was posted to the Western Front, to an even more terrible hell. There were many things William saw throughout his time in the war, all of them more horrific than you and I could possibly imagine. Entire landscapes, towns, homes and lives blown up before his very eyes. Yet this was war. He held his friend in his arms and wiped the residue of sweat from his forehead as his eyes closed eternally. This was war. He saw soldiers run blindly to their doom, and grown men weep for the life they left back home. This was war. Amongst these horrific visions, there were also those of good. Yes, my child, there was good to be seen during war. Amazing acts of courage. Men finding a power within themselves they never knew existed. Pure determination spreading throughout battalions like a contagious disease. These traits are ones that seem only to be at full strength during extreme adversity, but their presence in this war was to be remembered. This good, however, was staged in a world with horses stuck up to their bellies in the swamp of the trenches, and in fields that were once lush with green grass, now reduced to a quagmire of mud, blood, and bodies. Although this war continued until the 11th of November 1918, when Germany and all of its allies surrendered, William saw everything in 1 year at the Western Front. His first year was enough to corrupt his mind for eternity. On the evening of the 5th of November 1916, William marched with his platoon along the communication trenches of the Somme. The ground sank underfoot as the men ploughed through the muddy bog, and steady rain began to descend, landing lightly on their jackets, soaking through slowly to chill the skin. The men were silent, lost in their own thoughts, away from the terror they were living. Occasionally a man glanced up, as flares lit the darkened sky, or the sound of enemy machine guns echoed through the night. But the gaze was dropped, and he continued through the marsh, his mind back on the world he left at home, not even noticing when the destination was reached. A call of "Over, boys!" rang through the trenches, and the men leapt above the parapet into a world incomprehensible to those who had not lived it, plunging through rifle and machine gun fire into the muddy marsh of no man's land, were young men branded with nothing less than courage-stricken faces. As the barrage fell, the Australian soldiers found themselves well short of the intended position, and in the direct line of German fire. Forced to withdraw into their trenches and compose themselves for another attempt, the ANZACs were now in no doubt what this night had in store. Comrades shook hands, wished one another luck, kissed photographs of loved ones, and wondered aloud whether anyone would remember them back home. When the call again sounded, William clambered over the trench, facing a wall of bullets, each one on its own lethal path. Determination shone from every particle of his body, yet determination was not enough. The bullets directed towards William were each sent on a quest: to kill a man, ruin a prosperous life, destroy a laughing family, and shatter dreams of happiness. Each bullet was filled with the poison of a man's hate, the same hate that creates war. The craving for control, the inane desire to triumph over another, the madness that tells a man that power is worth killing. This was the content of the bullet that hit William. This was the force that brought him crashing to the ground. As he drew his final breath and took his last look upon the world, he saw nothing but hopelessness. He saw other bodies around him, lying motionless, anger that filled the sky, and then blackness. A fierce battle ended, and there were drops of water falling onto William's mud-stained uniform, rolling down his body and coming to rest in a growing puddle. These droplets were not only falling from the blackened sky, but also from the eyes of William's best friend as he clung to his lifeless body. William Fletcher, my child, was your great-granddad. Suddenly, Grandad's voice broke off. I jerked out of the land of hate and peril that I had been in, and glanced up into the weary face of a man who had divulged the saddest memory of his lifetime, up into his eyes that had lost their twinkle, to see a single tear roll down his cheek. Yes, if I were asked to tell where my appreciation of history came from, I would answer, that night. That night, I began to realise that there was so much to our past of which we are ignorant and must acknowledge. So much pain we could never dream of enduring. And as I stand on a battlefield in France, it is that moment I so vividly recall. I was only a child when I saw that tear on Grandad's face. I could not then understand its significance. No longer a child, I now proudly stand with my 8 friends in the fields of France, in the theatre that staged the atrocities of the hell we call war. We have come, each of us, to pay a debt to our forebearers, a debt of honour and gratitude, and a promise of remembrance. We stand, heads bowed, where thousands of men fell, fighting until the end for their country. I close my eyes to see grey nothingness engulf them, hear their unanswered plaintive cries, sense their blood pulsate with valour and honour. In that moment, I feel a single tear fall. We cannot return to the ANZACs the lives they lost for their country. We cannot cry them a sea of tears to wash them back, but we can give them something. Remembrance. Remembrance for what they have done, remembrance for what they never had the chance to do. As I pass the inscriptions written on the white sea of graves in France, many reading, "Known unto God," I ask myself how I could possibly make my generation understand the significance of what the ANZACs did for us. How could I make others understand the sacrifice and bloodshed to allow us to live as we do today? To many young Australians, the Great War may be just a battle fought many years ago, but it was one that ensured the freedom and peace we enjoy today. So I decided to write this story. When you read it, try imagining that William was your father, your brother, your husband or your son, for he was all these things and more. As winners of the 2005 Spirit of ANZAC study tour, as teenagers who have travelled the beautiful landscape of France and witnessed a glimpse of horror that happened during World War I, my 8 friends and I vow to give our ANZACs what they deserve. The ANZACs were remarkable men, some of the bravest men to walk this earth and leave footprints in our hearts. We will remember them, lest we forget.